Mariana opened her eyes slowly, the sterile, dim light of the hospital room blurring into focus. The air felt heavy with an unfamiliar scent, sharp and antiseptic, invading her senses. Confusion washed over her as she tried to piece together how she had ended up in this unrecognizable place. Panic surged within her, and she bolted upright, her heart pounding against her ribcage. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence surrounding her. Swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, she felt the coolness of the linoleum floor beneath her feet. She glanced around the room, noting the sparse furnishings, a single chair, a bedside table with a flickering lamp, and a large window heavily draped, blocking the outside world. The muted sounds of beeping machines and distant murmurs echoed through the walls, amplifying her sense of isolation. With no memory of how she arrived, a deep-seated dread began to unfurl in her stomach. Mariana stood, her legs trembling slightly as she steadied herself. She needed to find someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The corridor stretched endlessly, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. As she ventured forward, the atmosphere thickened, pregnant with silence. Figures in white coats and masks glided past her, their movements smooth and practiced, yet they offered no acknowledgement as she stood there, bewildered. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice echoing against the sterile walls. But the masked staff continued their work, their expressions hidden beneath layers of fabric. Panic clawed at her throat, and a sense of helplessness threatened to overwhelm her. "Hello? Can anyone help me?" she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. But her words fell into the void, swallowed by the oppressive silence that enveloped her. The hallway twisted and turned, each direction leading her deeper into confusion. As she moved further down the corridor, Mariana caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. Instinctively, she turned, and her breath caught in her throat. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, shrouded in shadow, its features indistinguishable. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, an ominous presence that sent shivers down her spine. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving her questioning her sanity. The sound of a door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. A nurse stepped out, her face obscured by a mask. "You shouldn't be wandering around," the nurse said, her tone flat and devoid of warmth. "You need to go back to your room." "Please, I don't know what's happening. I need to talk to someone," Mariana insisted, her voice trembling. The nurse merely gestured down the hallway, her eyes veiled with indifference. "Back to your room. You'll be cared for there." Frustration bubbled inside her as she watched the nurse disappear into the shadows. Mariana started, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she turned to the darkness behind her, the foreboding figure lingering at the edge of her vision. Her heart raced as she felt a pull, an urge to flee from the entity that seemed to shadow her every move. She took a step back, her instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. The hallway felt alive, each flickering light and distant echo a reminder of her isolation. The walls closed in on her, and she turned to run, her footsteps echoing loudly in the hollow space. But as she dashed down the corridor, the feeling of being watched intensified, a chilling sensation that gripped her heart. "Who are you?" she whispered into the emptiness, hoping for a response that would never come. The faceless figure loomed in her mind, a specter of dread that would not be shaken. As she rounded a corner, Mariana felt her breath quicken, the oppressive atmosphere tightening around her. She was trapped in a surreal nightmare, the boundaries of reality and fear blurring with each passing moment. And with each heartbeat, she knew she needed to find a way out, before the shadows consumed her entirely. Mariana's footsteps echoed eerily in the dimly lit corridor, each sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that enveloped her. The walls were a faded shade of white, peeling in some places, and the flickering fluorescent lights above cast unsettling shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. She pressed her back against the cool surface of the wall, trying to catch her breath, her heart racing not just from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of dread. As she moved deeper into the maze of the hospital, the air grew heavier, thick with an unidentifiable scent that made her stomach churn. She passed by abandoned rooms, their doors slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of disarray. Hospital beds draped in dusty sheets, empty IV stands, and scattered medical supplies that hinted at hasty departures. Each room seemed to tell a story, yet Mariana felt an insurmountable distance from them, as though the memories housed within were not hers to claim. Her fingers brushed against the wall for support as she turned a corner, and that's when she saw her, a nurse standing at the far end of the hall. The woman wore a mask that concealed her features, but something about her posture suggested an air of authority. Mariana's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. Maybe this nurse could help her understand where she was and how she had gotten there. "Excuse me," Mariana called out, her voice echoing and faltering. "Can you help me?" The masked nurse turned slowly, her movements deliberate, as if Mariana's words were an intrusion into a sacred silence. She raised her hand, gesturing toward the exit, but her eyes remained impassive, void of any compassion or recognition. "What exit?" Mariana pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't understand. I need to know what's happening." The nurse merely shook her head and pointed again, her posture stiffening as if Mariana's questions were too burdensome to bear. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on her, and before she could voice another plea, the nurse turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Mariana felt a chill crawl up her spine as she stood there, alone once more. The silence was deafening, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Glancing over her shoulder, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. The faceless figure stood just out of reach, its presence as unnerving as ever. Panic surged through her, and she spun on her heels, fleeing down the corridor. Each step felt like a desperate race against an unseen predator. She rounded a corner and skidded to a stop as she faced a mirror mounted on the wall. The reflection was disorienting. The faceless entity loomed behind her, its features a mere void that seemed to suck the light from the room. Mariana gasped, her pulse quickening as she stumbled backward, heart pounding against her ribcage. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The entity remained silent, its dark presence looming larger, as if it thrived on her fear. She turned away from the mirror, feeling a surge of determination mixed with dread. She had to find a way out of this nightmare, but the corridors twisted and turned like a labyrinth, leading her deeper into the unknown. As she ventured further, she began to hear soft murmurs echoing from the rooms she passed. Pausing, she strained to make out the words, but they were fragmented, like pieces of a long-forgotten conversation. The sounds tugged at her memory, a sense of familiarity that both intrigued and terrified her. She moved closer to one of the doors, its surface marred and chipped, and pushed it open just a crack. Inside, a patient sat on the edge of a bed, their face hidden beneath a tangle of hair. "You shouldn't be here," the voice was shaky, barely a whisper. "He's looking for you." "Who?" Mariana asked, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" But before the patient could answer, the room filled with a low hum, drowning out her words. Frustrated, Mariana stepped back, the oppressive atmosphere pushing her away. She turned to flee, but as she did, the faceless figure emerged from the shadows, standing at the door, blocking her escape. "Please, let me go!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the silence. But it was as if the walls themselves were swallowing her cries. The figure remained still, its formless shape a reminder of all that she wanted to forget. Clenching her fists, Mariana resolved to confront whatever lay ahead. She took a deep breath, summoning the courage she didn't feel. The chilling presence was a constant reminder of her past, but she refused to let it control her. With each step forward, she could feel the weight of her memories pressing down on her. And in that suffocating silence, she knew she had to confront the truth lurking within the shadows. Mariana stumbled through the dimly lit corridor, her heart racing with each echoing footstep. The walls were painted an unsettling shade of gray, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast elongated shadows that danced ominously. As she pressed on, the oppressive silence of the hospital enveloped her, amplifying her sense of dread. She could feel the weight of her fragmented memories pressing against her chest, but the details remained elusive, like wisps of fog slipping through her fingers. Suddenly, A faint whisper broke the silence. It came from a nearby room, its door slightly ajar. Curiosity piqued. Mariana approached cautiously, peering inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with medical equipment that seemed to have been abandoned in haste. In the corner sat a patient, her frail form shrouded in a thin blanket. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, and she trembled as if the very air around her was charged with a palpable anxiety. "Help me," the patient croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to leave this place." Mariana's heart skipped a beat. "Why? What's happening here?" she asked, desperate for answers. The woman's gaze darted to the shadows, her face pale. "It watches, always watching, the faceless one. It comes for those who don't listen." Mariana instinctively glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure lurking behind her. "Who is it? What does it want?" she pressed, her voice shaking. But the patient only shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "I tried to warn them, but they never heard. You have to run. It knows your name." Before Mariana could respond, the woman's expression shifted to one of sheer panic. "No, it's here!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the heavy atmosphere. She scrambled back against the wall, her hands trembling as she pointed towards the door. Mariana's heart raced as she turned to face the hallway, the familiar chill creeping up her spine. The faceless figure loomed at the end of the corridor, its presence more suffocating than ever. It was as if the very essence of her guilt had taken form, a dark silhouette that consumed the light around it. The air grew thick, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. "Mariana," a voice hissed, chilling and intimate, echoing her name in a way that made her blood run cold. Without thinking, she bolted from the room, her mind racing. The words of the patient echoed ominously in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was somehow tied to her past, a past that she desperately wanted to forget, yet was forced to confront in this twisted maze of a hospital. As she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, she stumbled into another room, this one filled with old photographs and medical charts. They were remnants of lives once lived, stories that had been abruptly cut short. Her heart sank as she recognized one of the faces, a young woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile. The name beneath the photo sent a jolt of recognition through her. Sarah, a patient she had once cared for, someone she had failed. "No, no, no," Mariana whispered, backing away as memories flooded back, each one sharper than the last. She had been there when Sarah coded, had felt the helplessness wash over her as she fumbled with the defibrillator, her hands trembling. "I should have saved you," she murmured, tears streaming down her cheeks. The faceless figure seemed to materialize closer, its presence suffocating. "You couldn't save her," it whispered, the voice taking on a mocking tone. "You never can." Mariana clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the guilt was a relentless tide, pulling her under. She turned to flee, but the walls of the hospital seemed to close in around her, and the whispers grew louder, echoing her failures. Each room she entered was a reminder of another life lost, another chance missed. "Please, I'm sorry," she cried out, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to." But the whispers only intensified, drowning her pleas. As she stumbled down the corridor, she could feel the figure close behind her, its chilling breath brushing against her neck. Desperation clawed at her throat, and for a moment she felt utterly lost, trapped in a cycle of regret with no way out. "Mariana," the voice echoed again, and she knew she had to confront the darkness that haunted her. But with every step, the shadows deepened, and she could feel the weight of her past pulling her back, threatening to engulf her in the very despair she sought to escape. Mariana stepped cautiously through the dimly lit corridor, her heart pounding as the oppressive silence enveloped her. The walls seemed to close in, adorned with cracked paint and peeling wallpaper that whispered tales of despair. She could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, the specters of patients long gone, their unfulfilled cries echoing in her mind. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and as she rounded another corner, she found herself standing before a group of patients, each one wearing a mask that obscured their faces, their expressions frozen in a mixture of sorrow and fear. One patient, a woman with trembling hands, caught Mariana's attention. The woman's mask was adorned with intricate patterns, but the eyes, oh those eyes, were filled with an unbearable sadness. "Help us," the woman whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. "We're trapped here, just like you." Mariana felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? How can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling as she approached. But the woman only shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You must confront it. The figure, it feeds on your guilt. The more you run, the stronger it becomes." Mariana pressed her lips together, feeling the weight of those words settle in her chest. The faceless figure had been a constant shadow, lurking just out of sight, growing more palpable with every step she took. "I don't know how to confront anything," she admitted, desperation clawing at her throat. "I don't even know why I'm here." The woman reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against Mariana's arm. "You must remember, only then can you find the truth. Only then can you be free." Mariana's breath hitched as fragmented memories surged through her mind. Flashes of a hospital room, the frantic beeping of machines, and a face, a patient's face, twisted in pain. She recoiled, shaking her head. "No, I can't remember. I can't face it." Suddenly the lights flickered, and a low hum filled the corridor, intensifying the sense of dread. The faceless figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness, its presence palpable and suffocating. Mariana's heart raced as she caught a glimpse of its form, a swirling mass that seemed to absorb the very light around it. "Run," the woman urged, her voice rising in panic. "It's here." Mariana turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold floor as she navigated through the maze of despair. She could hear the whispers of the patients, their voices merging into a haunting chorus. "It knows you," they chanted. "It knows your guilt." As she fled, she felt a cold breath on her neck, the figure closing in, its presence tightening around her like a vice. She stumbled into a room, the door slamming shut behind her. The therapy room. The sign above the door flickered ominously, casting unsettling shadows across the walls. Mariana leaned against the door, gasping for breath as she looked around. The room was stark and clinical, filled with chairs arranged in a circle, a single flickering bulb overhead casting an eerie glow. In the center stood a large mirror, its surface fogged and streaked. She approached it hesitantly, her reflection wavering as if the glass held more than just her image. The faceless figure loomed behind her in the reflection, its form shifting and writhing. "Face me," it seemed to whisper, the words chilling her to the core. "What do you want from me?" Mariana cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to make it stop." "Confront your past," the figure seemed to respond, its tone echoing in her mind. "Only then can you find peace." Mariana's heart raced as fragments of memories began to flood back, her last shift, the patient who had died under her care, the frantic attempts to save a life slipping away. "I failed you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't save you." The reflection in the mirror twisted, morphing into the face of the patient she could not save, a visage of pain and regret. "You can't run from me, Mariana," it seemed to say. "You must accept what happened." "I'm sorry," Mariana cried, her voice echoing against the sterile walls. "I'm so sorry." But the figure only lingered, its shape coiling around her like smoke, whispering her name with a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. The room began to spin, the walls closing in, and she felt herself being pulled deeper into the core of her guilt. Desperation gripped her heart as she sensed the truth. She could no longer evade her past. She had to confront the darkness that haunted her, but the enormity of it all threatened to swallow her whole. As she stood before the mirror, the faceless figure loomed larger, its intentions shrouded in a haunting uncertainty. "Face your truth," it urged, the room vibrating with an unsettling energy. With a deep breath, Mariana steeled herself. It was time to confront the shadows of her regret. Inside the therapy room, the atmosphere shifted palpably, the air thick with tension and unspoken fears. Dim light flickered from a single bulb overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls, echoing the turmoil within Mariana's heart. She took a deep breath, her pulse quickening as she faced the empty chair across from her, a chair that now felt like an altar of her despair. The faceless figure loomed in the corner, its presence suffocating. It seemed to absorb the light, growing darker and more menacing as Mariana's resolve faltered. She clenched her fists, feeling the cold sweat bead on her brow. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. In response, the figure remained silent, its emptiness almost mocking. With a deep breath, Mariana moved toward the center of the room, her determination battling the creeping dread. "I know why you're here," she said, her voice steadier now. "You represent everything I lost, every life I couldn't save." As she spoke, memories surged within her, vivid and painful. The frantic beeping of machines, the desperate pleas of patients, and the paralyzing guilt that had settled in her chest like lead. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the walls around her began to pulse, like the heartbeat of the very hospital she was trapped in. She could feel the weight of her past pressing down on her, each heartbeat a reminder of the patient she had failed. "I'm sorry," Mariana cried out, her voice echoing in the small room. "I didn't mean to let you down." The figure stirred, and for a moment, Mariana thought she saw a flash of something. An expression, perhaps? The flicker of a lost soul. "Forgive me," she added, her voice breaking. "Please." But as the words left her lips, the room began to distort, the walls bending and twisting as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The faceless entity stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You think saying sorry is enough?" it whispered, the voice a chilling wind that sent shivers down her spine. "You think you can just erase the past?" Mariana felt the ground beneath her shift, the floor tilting, causing her to stumble. "No!" she shouted, panic rising in her throat. "I can't go back. I have to move forward." But each step she took felt heavier, as if the weight of her regret was anchoring her to the spot. "Face it, Mariana," the figure hissed, its form beginning to morph, shadows swirling around it. "You can't escape what you've done. You're trapped in your own mind." The word struck her like a blow. "I'm not trapped," she insisted, though doubt laced her voice. "I will find a way out. I won't let you control me." In that moment, the room shifted again, and she was transported back to the hospital room where it had all happened. She could see the patient lying there, frail and helpless, a once vibrant soul now reduced to a mere shadow of existence. Tears streamed down Mariana's face as she whispered, "I tried. I truly tried." Suddenly the figure loomed larger, eclipsing the patient's frail form. "Did you?" it questioned, the voice dripping with contempt. "Did you really try, or did you simply give up?" Mariana's heart raced, and she felt the walls closing in, the reality of the moment suffocating. "I didn't give up," she cried. "I just didn't know how to save you." The figure paused, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to consider her words. "Then prove it," it challenged, the shadows swirling in an ominous dance. "Face your guilt. Confront your past." With renewed determination, Mariana stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I will," she vowed, her voice resonating with a fierce clarity. "I will confront my mistakes. I will not let you take away my hope." As she reached out toward the figure, the room began to tremble, and a blinding light enveloped her. For a heartbeat, she felt weightless, suspended between her past and a possible future. But as quickly as it came, the light flickered, and the shadows returned, threatening to engulf her once more. "Face the truth, Mariana," the figure urged, its voice now a haunting whisper. "Only then can you find peace." And with that, the therapy room began to dissolve around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness, where her past awaited her. But within that darkness, a sliver of hope ignited, a chance to reclaim her life from the shadows of regret. Mariana stood in the therapy room, her heart pounding as the distorted shadows of her guilt danced around her. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of her unspoken regrets. The faceless figure loomed in front of her, an amorphous mass of despair and anger. It seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, each throb echoing her own internal turmoil. The walls of the room began to tremble, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows that twisted into grotesque shapes. "Why won't you let me go?" Mariana cried out, her voice trembling. The figure remained silent, its presence suffocatingly close. She took a deep breath, fighting against the overwhelming urge to flee. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I tried to save her." In that moment, The figure began to shift. With a sudden jolt, it morphed into the image of the patient she had failed to save. A young woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile. Mariana's breath caught in her throat. "No, it can't be you." The patient's lips moved, but no sound came forth. Instead, Mariana could hear the echoes of the past reverberating in her mind. The frantic beeping of machines, the urgent whispers of her colleagues, and the final desperate plea of the woman as she slipped away. "I'm so sorry," Mariana whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I did everything I could." The patient's expression was serene yet filled with sorrow. "You didn't understand," the figure seemed to say, its voice a haunting whisper that wrapped around Mariana like a shroud. "You can't save everyone, Mariana, but you can learn to forgive yourself." Mariana shook her head, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a lead blanket. "Forgive myself? How can I? You died because of me." The walls of the room shook violently, and the shadows swirled in a tempest of grief and despair. "Look at me, Mariana," the figure urged, its face still obscured, but the eyes now piercing through the mask of shadows. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to help you find peace. You must confront what you've buried deep inside." With trembling hands, Mariana reached out, the warmth of her palm brushing against the coldness of the figure. "I don't want to be trapped in this nightmare," she choked out, her voice quaking with emotion. "I just want to wake up." The figure's form shifted again, and suddenly, Mariana found herself back in the hospital room where it all began. The sterile scent of antiseptic, the soft beeping of monitors. The young woman lay in the bed, breathing rapidly. Mariana felt a rush of memories flood back, the frantic moments of trying to stabilize her, the overwhelming pressure of the situation closing in around her. "Please, stay with me," Mariana shouted, desperation coating her voice. The figure of the patient shimmered, tears in her eyes, and for a moment their gazes locked. "Mariana, remember me not in your guilt, but in the lives you've touched," the figure implored. "You've saved others. You've made a difference. Don't let this consume you." As the room continued to warp and twist around her, Mariana felt a flicker of understanding ignite within her. She had been so consumed by her failure that she had forgotten the impact of her successes. "I can't change what happened," she whispered, her voice softening. "But I can remember you." The walls closed in, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole, but the figure remained, a beacon of light among the shadows. "Embrace your past, Mariana. It's part of you, but it doesn't define you." With a surge of determination, Mariana stepped closer to the figure. The hospital trembled violently, but she held her ground. "I forgive you," she said, the words spilling from her heart. "And I forgive myself." A blinding light enveloped her, and for a fleeting moment she felt free. But as the brightness dimmed, the reality of the collapsing hospital returned. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the sense of despair clawed at her. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the weight of her choices crashing down around her. "I tried to move on, but I'm still here, aren't I?" The figure nodded, its expression filled with compassion. "You are here, but you can still find your way back. The cycle of regret can end, but only if you let it." As the darkness threatened to pull her under, Mariana clung to the figure, understanding that her journey was far from over. Trapped yet liberated, she faced the abyss, ready to confront the shadows of regret that had haunted her. A reminder that while she may never forget, she could learn to live again. Clara stepped out of her car and onto the cracked pavement of the nursing home, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The building loomed before her, a sprawling structure with faded yellow paint and ivy creeping up its walls. The air was thick with an unsettling atmosphere, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of secrets and sorrows. She took a deep breath, adjusting her scrub top and smoothing her hair back into a neat bun. Today marked the beginning of her career as a nurse, and she was determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she entered the building, a bell chimed softly, announcing her arrival. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow in the dim corridor. Clara's footsteps echoed as she walked, the sound magnified in the stillness. A group of nurses huddled together at the front desk, their voices hushed. She caught snippets of conversation, words like dark nurse and haunted, drifting through the air. Clara raised an eyebrow, intrigued yet skeptical. Surely these were just tales to scare the newcomers. "Welcome, Clara," called out a nurse with a warm smile, her name tag reading Linda. "We've all been expecting you. Just be cautious. This place has a reputation." Clara chuckled lightly, dismissing the warning. "I'll be fine. I've dealt with worse during my training." But as she ventured deeper into the nursing home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the shadows danced just beyond her line of sight. Her first encounter was with Mrs. Almeida, a frail lady with silver hair and kind eyes. She sat in a well-worn armchair, knitting needles clicking together as she worked on a colorful scarf. "Ah, a new face. You must be Clara," Mrs. Almeida said, her voice soft yet firm. "You should be careful here, dear. The dark nurse still roams these halls." Clara raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "The dark nurse? I've heard some whispers about her, but I thought it was just a story." Mrs. Almeida paused, her knitting coming to a halt. "Oh, it's no story, Clara. She was a cruel woman, and her spirit hasn't found peace. I've seen her, lurking in the shadows, watching us." "Really?" Clara replied, half amused and half concerned. "What did she do?" "She hurt the residents, dear. Many of us still remember," Mrs. Almeida said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Just promise me you'll be careful. She likes to prey on the young and unwary." Clara smiled politely, trying to ease the tension. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm sure it's just an old wives' tale." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the nursing home, Clara prepared for her first night shift. The building creaked and groaned, the sounds echoing like whispers through the halls. She brushed it off as the old structure settling, but a shiver ran down her spine. The flickering lights overhead added to her unease, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than she cared to admit. That night, as Clara made her rounds, she heard strange noises, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor, and distant murmurs that seemed to call her name. "It's just the wind," she reassured herself. But the chill in the air told a different story. The sensation of being watched intensified, and she quickened her pace, eager to finish her tasks. In one of the rooms, she found Mrs. Almeida asleep, the gentle rise and fall of her chest a comforting sight. Clara paused, contemplating the stories she had heard. With a shake of her head, she dismissed them as mere figments of imagination, products of an overactive mind. But as she turned to leave, the lights flickered again, plunging the corridor into darkness for a brief moment. When they returned, Clara felt an icy breeze brush past her, whispering secrets that sent shivers down her spine. She stood frozen, heart racing, as the inexplicable weight of the nursing home enveloped her, leaving her questioning her beliefs and the very fabric of reality. "Just keep it together, Clara," she murmured to herself, forcing a smile as she moved down the hallway. Yet deep down she knew that the night was just beginning, and that the nursing home held more than just the echoes of its residents. Shadows danced at the corners of her vision, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the dark nurse was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make her presence known. As Clara began her shifts at the nursing home, the weight of the building's history hung heavy in the air, thickening her resolve and dampening her spirit. The other nurses moved about the facility with an air of caution, their whispers barely audible but laden with unspoken fears. She often found them exchanging glances, their eyes darting toward the shadows that danced along the walls, as if the very architecture were a living entity, watching and waiting. During her first week, Clara had tried to engage them in conversation about the nursing home's past, but each inquiry was met with a quick change of subject or an uncomfortable silence that made her skin crawl. One afternoon, while administering medication to Mrs. Almeida, Clara noticed the older woman's gaze drifting toward the window, her face pale and serious. "Do you ever wonder about the stories these walls could tell?" Clara asked, attempting to break the tension. Mrs. Almeida turned to Clara, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and nostalgia. "Oh, my dear, this place has seen more than its share of sorrow, and some of it lingers still." "What do you mean?" Clara pressed, eager for more than vague allusions. "The dark nurse. whispered Mrs. Almeida, lowering her voice as if afraid to be overheard. She roamed these halls decades ago, bringing despair to anyone who crossed her path. I've seen her, you know. Not too long ago, she stood at the end of my bed, glaring at me with her cold, dead eyes. Clara felt a chill creep down her spine. That sounds terrifying, but surely that was just your imagination? Mrs. Almeida shook her head vigorously. No, dear. It was real, and she's still here watching. You must be careful. Later that evening, as Clara settled in for her night shift, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The nursing home creaked and groaned around her, reminiscent of a ship at sea. As she made her rounds, she caught snippets of conversation between residents in the common room. Their voices were hushed, and Clara leaned in closer, straining to hear. "She came for me last week," a frail man said, his hands trembling. I felt her breath on my neck, cold as ice. Another resident chimed in, "And she whispered my name. I thought I was losing my mind." Clara's heart raced at the chilling tales. She had dismissed the ghost stories as mere folklore, but there was an undeniable weight to their words, a collective fear that tied them together like a thick fog. Who was this dark nurse that haunted their nights, and why did she seem to be growing bolder? Hours slipped by, and as the clock struck midnight, Clara found herself alone on the floor, the silence pressing in like a vice. Suddenly, an icy breeze swept through the corridor. Clara shivered, her breath hitching in her throat. It felt as if the air itself had turned to ice, wrapping around her like a shroud. Then she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible yet unmistakably calling her name. "Clara! Clara!" She spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty, only the flickering lights above casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Hello?" she called, her voice wavering slightly. No reply came, only the faint echo of her own words. Determined to shake off the unease, Clara continued her duties, but the feeling of dread lingered. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the curtains felt amplified, as if the building was alive, breathing, waiting. As she approached the nurses' station, she noticed her colleagues huddled together, their voices low. What are they talking about? Clara wondered, stepping closer. But the moment she approached, the conversation ceased. They exchanged uneasy glances, and one nurse, a tall woman with dark hair, quickly turned away, as though Clara had interrupted something forbidden. "Everything okay?" Clara asked, trying to maintain her composure. "Just the usual," the nurse replied, her tone clipped. "You should focus on your patients, Clara. It's best not to dwell on the past." The warning hung in the air, a heavy cloud that settled over Clara's shoulders. She had come to the nursing home to help, to care for the residents, but it seemed each passing day only drew her deeper into the shadows of its haunted history. As she made her way back down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that every step she took echoed through the years, a prelude to something dark that awaited her in the very depths of the nursing home. Clara stood in the dimly lit break room, a faded photograph clutched tightly in her hand. The image depicted a stern-looking nurse, her eyes sharp and piercing, a cruel smile ghosting her lips. Clara felt an unsettling shiver creep down her spine. The resemblance to Mr. Vieira, one of the residents, was uncanny. He had often shared stories of the past, tales filled with shadows of a bygone era, but now his face loomed in her mind like a specter. How could this be? She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the hum of the old refrigerator. Deciding to confront Mr. Vieira, she found him seated in his usual spot by the window, staring out at the overgrown garden as if lost in time. His frail hands trembled slightly, cradling a chipped teacup. Clara approached cautiously, her heart racing. "Mr. Vieira," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Can we talk about the nurse in this photograph?" His eyes flickered to her, a mix of recognition and unease crossing his features. "Ah, the dark nurse," he murmured, his gaze drifting back to the garden. "She ruled this place with an iron fist. Many feared her, Clara. She didn't just take care of the residents, she controlled them." "What do you mean?" Clara pressed, settling into the chair opposite him. "Did you know her?" Mr. Vieira nodded slowly, his face etched with memories too painful to share. She was a monster, Clara. I watched as she took joy in the suffering of others. When I was a boy, I was sent here for a brief stay. She was the reason I never returned to my family. They said I was unfit to go home." He paused, swallowing hard. "I still hear her whispers in the night. She doesn't rest, you know." Clara felt a chill seep into her bones. What happened to her? Why is she still here? Bad things happen when a soul is trapped by its own hatred. She enjoyed her power too much to let go, Mr. Vieira replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And now, she seeks to reclaim that power through us. The weight of his words settled heavily on Clara's shoulders. She thought of the recent deaths, the residents who had collapsed without explanation, and the frantic whispers that filled the halls. "I don't believe she can harm us. I'm here to protect you all," Clara asserted, though her voice wavered slightly. Mr. Vieira's eyes darkened. "She'll come for you too, the new nurse, the fresh blood. She wants to continue her legacy. You must be careful, Clara." As the days passed, Clara's unease grew. The nursing home felt alive. Shadows stretching and creeping along the walls, whispering secrets she couldn't quite grasp. One evening, while preparing medications, a sudden cry echoed through the corridor. Clara rushed out, her heart pounding, only to find another resident, Mrs. Thompson, crumpled on the floor, gasping for breath. "Help, someone, please!" Clara shouted, her voice slicing through the stillness. She knelt beside Mrs. Thompson, her hand shaking as she checked for a pulse. It was weak, fading. "Stay with me, Mrs. Thompson. Help is on the way." But it was too late. Within moments, the once vibrant woman lay still, her eyes wide open, staring into the void. Clara's heart sank as the reality of the situation washed over her. Panic surged through her, and she looked around, searching for someone, anyone who could help. The other nurses appeared, faces pale and drawn. They quickly assessed the scene, but Clara could see the fear in their eyes. "Another one murmured, her voice trembling. "This can't keep happening." Clara felt increasingly isolated, the whispers of the residents echoing in her mind. They spoke of the dark nurse, of her eyes watching from the shadows, of the curse that seemed to linger in the air like a thick fog. "We need to do something," Clara urged the other nurses one evening, desperation coloring her tone. "We can't just stand by and let this continue." One of the nurses, a tall woman with weary eyes, shook her head. "You don't understand, Clara. This is beyond us. There are things here, things we cannot fight. But we can't let fear dictate our actions. We owe it to the residents to protect them," Clara insisted, her voice rising. The tall nurse stepped back, her expression hardening. "You're playing with fire, Clara. The dark nurse doesn't take kindly to those who challenge her." Clara's resolve wavered, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had come to the nursing home to care for the residents, to offer them comfort. But now she found herself ensnared in a web of fear and death. As she walked the dimly lit halls, she could feel the eyes of the dark nurse upon her, watching, waiting. And she knew time was running out. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The nursing home's oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken around her as she descended the narrow staircase leading to the basement. The flickering lights above cast elongated shadows that danced on the walls, whispering secrets of a time long past. Thunder rumbled outside, the storm intensifying as if nature itself conspired to heighten the tension brewing in the air. As she reached the bottom step, she hesitated. The basement was dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of decay and neglect. Old furniture lay draped in sheets, forgotten relics of the past. Clara felt an inexplicable pull towards a corner where the shadows seemed to gather, forming ominous shapes that flickered in and out of visibility. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What am I doing?" she muttered to herself, but her curiosity was insatiable. In that shadowy corner, Clara discovered a dusty trunk, its surface marred by years of neglect. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a collection of yellowed papers and a worn leather-bound journal. The name inscribed on the front cover sent a chill down her spine. Nurse Edith Hawthorne. Clara's fingers brushed against the pages, and she felt a jolt of energy surge through her. It was as if the very essence of the cruel nurse still lingered within those pages, eager to share its dark tales. Flipping through the journal, Clara's eyes widened at the disturbing entries. Edith's words were filled with bitterness and malice, recounting her disdain for the residents she was supposed to care for. "They are weak, pathetic creatures," one entry read. "I will show them what true pain is. Only then will they understand the power I hold over life and death." Clara's stomach churned as she read the chilling accounts of abuse and neglect, the once vibrant lives extinguished under the nurse's cold gaze. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the basement, causing Clara to jump. The shadows seemed to writhe, and a low whispering filled the air, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. "Clara! Clara!" It was her name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and utterly foreign. Panic surged within her. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over the trunk as she turned to flee. But as she raced up the stairs, the shadows followed, taunting her with their whispers. "You cannot escape us," they hissed. "You are one of us now." Clara burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, her heart racing as she leaned against it, gasping for breath. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a mournful spirit. She glanced around the dimly lit hallway, her senses heightened. The nursing home felt alive, the walls vibrating with an energy that was both unsettling and intoxicating. Yet the safety she craved seemed elusive. Just then Mrs. Almeida shuffled past her, her expression clouded with worry. "Clara, dear, you should not be down there," she said, her voice quivering. "The shadows, they are hungry." "What do you mean, Mrs. Almeida?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Edith's spirit," she replied, her eyes wide with fear. "It feeds on those who dare to dig into the past. You must stop investigating." Clara shook her head, determination burning in her eyes. "I need to know the truth. People are dying, Mrs. Almeida. I can't just stand by." Mrs. Almeida's face fell, and she reached for Clara's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You don't understand, child. The truth is more dangerous than you can imagine." Before Clara could respond, a loud crash echoed from the residents' lounge, drawing their attention. They rushed towards the sound, only to find the room in disarray, furniture overturned and a chilling silence hanging in the air. Clara's heart sank as she noticed an empty bed, its occupant, Mr. Vieira, nowhere to be found. "Where's Mr. Vieira?" Clara asked, panic creeping into her voice. I don't know," Mrs. Almeida stammered, her eyes darting around the room. "He was just here." A sense of urgency washed over Clara. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture was far from clear. "We need to find him," she said firmly, turning towards the staff room where she hoped to find the other nurses. As she hurried down the hallway, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and contract, whispering threats that echoed in her mind. "You're running out of time, Clara," they seemed to say. "You cannot hide from what you are destined to face." With each step, the weight of the nursing home's dark history pressed down on her. Clara's resolve hardened. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But deep down, a flicker of doubt began to take root. What if the truth was more horrifying than she could bear? As the storm outside raged on, Clara felt the chilling hand of fate drawing closer, and she knew that soon she would have to confront the darkness that lurked within the walls of the nursing home. Clara stood outside the head nurse's office, her heart racing as she prepared to confront the woman who had become a figure of intimidation in the nursing home. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting unsettling shadows that danced along the walls. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent corridor. "Come in," a sharp voice called from within. Pushing the door open, Clara stepped inside. The head nurse, a tall woman with stern features and cold eyes, sat behind a cluttered desk, paperwork strewn before her like remnants of a battlefield. Clara felt a chill sweep through the room, as if the air had thickened with unspoken dread. "Can I help you?" the head nurse asked, her tone icy. "I wanted to talk about the occurrences here," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've heard some unsettling stories from the residents and—" "Enough," the head nurse interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You'd do well to keep your head down and focus on your job. This place has a history best left buried." Clara's stomach twisted, frustration bubbling within her. "But people are dying, and I believe there's something more to it. The residents deserve to know." "Do not speak of things you do not understand," the head nurse hissed, leaning forward. "You have no idea what you're inviting into this home. I suggest you stop asking questions." Clara felt the weight of the woman's gaze pressing down on her, the warning hanging in the air like an ominous cloud. She left the office, her resolve shaken but not broken. The head nurse's hostility only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. As the days passed, Clara's unease deepened. Each night she returned to the ward, shadows lurking in the corners of her vision, and the whispers of the residents haunted her thoughts. Then, one evening, as she made her rounds, she entered Mr. Vieira's room. The elderly man lay frail in his bed, his eyes closed, and Clara felt a sense of foreboding settle over her. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept through the room, and Clara shivered, her breath hitching in her throat. She glanced towards the window, but it was shut tight. As she turned back, her gaze fell upon a figure, an ethereal woman standing at Mr. Vieira's bedside, her face obscured by shadows. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the ghostly presence lean closer, whispering something inaudible to the old man. "Mr. Vieira?" Clara called, her voice trembling. The figure turned, and Clara's breath caught. The resemblance to the cruel nurse from the photograph was unmistakable. The ghost's eyes glinted with malice, and in an instant, Mr. Vieira gasped, his body convulsing before going still. Panic surged through Clara as she rushed to his side, feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. "No, no, no," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. The realization hit her like a freight train. The stories she had dismissed as mere folklore were all too real. The dark nurse was not just a specter of the past, she was here, and Clara was powerless to stop her. Desperate for escape, Clara raced down the hall, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. She needed to leave the nursing home, to distance herself from the malevolent presence that loomed over her. But as she reached the exit, a cold voice echoed through the corridor, sending chills down her spine. "Do you really think you can escape your fate, Clara?" Startled, she turned to find the source of the voice. But the corridor was empty. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in her chest. The walls of the nursing home seemed to close in around her, and she knew deep down that leaving might not be an option. "Who's there?" Clara shouted, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" Silence enveloped her, heavy and suffocating. The shadows grew darker, twisting and turning as if alive, and the walls whispered her name in a mournful chant. "Clara! Clara!" She stumbled backward, her heart racing as the realization dawned upon her. This was just the beginning. The spirit was toying with her, pulling her deeper into its web of despair. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear, the nursing home transformed around her, each creak of the floorboards and flicker of the lights amplifying the sense of impending doom. Clara knew she had to confront the darkness, but the thought of what lay ahead filled her with a terror she could hardly bear. Clara stood in the dimly lit common room of the nursing home, her heart racing as she looked around at the dwindling number of residents. The once vibrant atmosphere now felt suffocating, filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Shadows danced in the corners, and the whispers of the past echoed in her ears. She knew she had to act, and the thought of performing a ritual to break the curse had been gnawing at her mind ever since she stumbled upon the journal of the cruel nurse. With a deep breath, Clara gathered the few residents who remained lucid enough to participate. Mrs. Almeida, Mr. Vieira, and a curious young man named Lucas, who had only recently been admitted, settled in a circle around her. The flickering lights cast eerie patterns on their faces, but Clara forced herself to meet their gazes. "I believe that if we come together, we can confront the spirit that haunts this place," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mrs. Almeida nodded slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "You really think it will work, dear?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara reached out and squeezed the old woman's hand. "It has to work. We can't let her take anyone else." As the group settled down, Clara opened the journal she had found, its pages yellowed and fragile. "I've read about a chant that can summon her," Clara explained, her heart pounding with anticipation. "But we need to focus our energy on love and light to counter her darkness." "Are you sure it's a good idea?" Lucas asked, glancing nervously around the room. "What if she comes for us while we're doing this?" "She's already taken too many," Clara replied firmly. "We can't let fear control us any longer." They held hands, forming a circle, as Clara began to chant the words she had memorized. Her voice rose and fell, weaving through the air like a fragile thread. The atmosphere thickened, a palpable energy enveloping them as they repeated the incantation together. Shadows flickered and swirled, and Clara felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, sending shivers down her spine. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the lights flickered violently. The air grew heavy with malevolence, and Clara's heart raced as she sensed the presence of the cruel nurse. A figure began to materialize in the center of the circle, her face obscured by darkness, but Clara could feel the hatred radiating from her. "Foolish mortals," the spirit hissed, her voice a chilling whisper that sent fear racing through Clara's veins. "You think you can break the cycle? You are destined to serve me." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the voice. "No," she gasped, stepping forward. "I won't let you take anyone else. I'm here to stop you." The spirit's laughter echoed through the room, a sound filled with malice. "You cannot escape your fate, Clara. You are the reincarnation of my tormentor, bound to continue my legacy of vengeance. You will take my place." Clara staggered back, horrified. "No, I only wanted to help." "Help?" the spirit sneered, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You think you're any different from me? You will become the very thing you sought to destroy." In that moment, a wave of realization crashed over Clara. All she had wanted was to save the residents, to protect them from the spirit's wrath. But instead, she was now standing on the precipice of becoming the next victim of the malevolent entity that had haunted this place for decades. "Please, no!" Clara cried, but it was too late. The energy in the room shifted, pulling her toward the vengeful spirit. The other residents gasped, their expressions a mix of horror and despair, as Clara felt the darkness enveloping her. "Join me, Clara," the spirit whispered, her voice seductive and cruel. "Embrace your true nature." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she fought against the gravitational pull of the spirit's wrath. "I won't. I refuse." But her resistance faltered, and as she felt her essence being consumed, she knew deep down that the cycle was not just about the cruel nurse's vengeance. It was about her own choices, her own fears, and in that tragic twist of fate, Clara understood that she had become the next keeper of the curse, forever trapped in the haunted nursing home, a guardian of the very darkness she had sought to banish. Anna stepped out of the cab, her heart racing as she took in the sight of the isolated psychiatric ward. The building loomed ahead, its gray stone facade weathered by years of neglect, surrounded by a tangled mass of overgrown weeds and twisted trees that seemed to whisper secrets among themselves. Despite the sweltering summer heat, a chill crept into her bones, as if the very air was laden with unspoken fears. She shivered involuntarily and adjusted the straps of her nurse's bag, steeling herself for her first day. Walking through the heavy iron gates, Anna felt a sense of unease settle over her. The ward's entrance, lined with tall, dark windows, appeared almost watchful, as if the building itself were alive, observing her every move. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the orientation that lay ahead. Inside, the air was stale and thick, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. During the orientation, she was introduced to the head psychiatrist, Dr. Ribeiro, a tall man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to penetrate her very soul. "Welcome, Anna," he said, his voice smooth yet unsettling. "You will find that our patients are rather unique. It is essential that they remain silent." Anna frowned, glancing at the other staff members who exchanged wary glances. "Silent? Why?" she asked, curiosity piqued. Dr. Ribeiro's smile faltered slightly. "It's for their own good. "We've found that verbal communication can be detrimental to their treatment. They must learn to express themselves through other means." His eyes narrowed as he continued, "I trust you will respect our protocols." As the day wore on, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She wandered through the dimly lit hallways, peering into the rooms where the patients resided. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of fabric or the distant sound of a door creaking. Each room held a patient whose eyes spoke of untold stories and hidden fears, yet their lips remained sealed, almost as if they were trapped in their own minds. That night, as Anna settled into her quarters, the walls of her small room felt like they were closing in on her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Just as she began to drift off, a faint sound echoed through the hallway, a soft, eerie laughter that sent a shiver racing down her spine. She bolted upright, heart pounding, straining to listen. "Is someone there?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. The laughter faded, replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to mock her fear. She pulled the covers closer, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the sound had felt too real, too close. Anna tossed and turned, desperately trying to find comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. Every creak of the building felt like a whisper, every shadow a potential threat. She closed her eyes tightly, yearning for sleep, but the laughter returned, echoing through the empty hallways like a sinister lullaby. It wrapped around her, squeezing her with an icy grip. Determined to confront whatever haunted the halls, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her bare feet sinking into the cold wooden floor. She stepped cautiously toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "It's probably just the wind," she murmured to herself, trying to muster courage. As she opened the door, a chill rushed past her, and she could almost hear the laughter again, now mingled with whispers that seemed to swirl around her. Anna stepped into the hallway, the flickering lights casting long dancing shadows that twisted and turned, making her heart race even faster. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing into the darkness. There was no answer, only the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She hesitated, glancing back toward her room, but curiosity propelled her forward into the depths of the ward. Each step felt heavier, the silence thickening like a fog, as she ventured deeper into the unknown. But with each passing moment, the laughter faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness that filled her with dread. Something was wrong here, she thought, and she was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant unraveling the very fabric of the silence that surrounded her. The next morning, Anna stepped cautiously into the bustling staff room, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that hung over the ward. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently, casting a harsh glow that seemed to heighten the tension in the air. She noted the nurses gathered in clusters, their hushed tones barely rising above the hum of the machines that monitored the patients. As she approached the coffee station, she could feel their eyes darting toward her, filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning, Anna," greeted a tall nurse with a weary smile. "I'm Clara." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid to disturb the fragile atmosphere. "Hi, Clara," Anna replied, trying to project confidence despite the unsettling feeling in her gut. "I'm still getting used to everything here," Clara nodded, her eyes flickering momentarily to the other nurses, who exchanged glances laden with unspoken words. "It can be challenging. Just remember to keep your head down and follow the rules," she advised, her tone shifting slightly as if she were imparting a warning. "What do you mean by rules?" Anna inquired, curiosity piqued. Before Clara could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Just don't ask questions, Anna. It's easier that way," a shorter nurse interjected. Her name tag read Sophia, and her eyes held a mixture of frustration and fear. Anna frowned, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. "But what happened to the previous nurses? I heard things." Sophia's expression hardened, and she glanced at Clara, who quickly looked away. "They just moved on. It's a tough place. We all have our reasons for being here." The conversation was abruptly halted as the head psychiatrist, Dr. Ribeiro, entered the room with an air of authority. His presence silenced the chatter, and the nurses straightened, their demeanor shifting to one of subservience. "Good morning, team. I trust everyone is ready for another productive day?" His voice was smooth, but there was an underlying menace that made Anna's skin crawl. "Yes, doctor," the nurses replied in unison, their voices lacking enthusiasm. As the day progressed, Anna found herself assigned to Louise, a patient whose haunted eyes seemed to hold secrets too terrible to share. She approached his room with trepidation, the door creaking ominously as she pushed it open. Louise sat in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest, his gaze fixated on the shadows dancing across the walls. "Hello, Louise," Anna said softly, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I'm here to help you." He flinched at her voice, his body tensing as he whispered, "They're watching. They know." Anna's heart raced. "Who knows?" she pressed, leaning closer. "The ones in the dark," he replied, his voice trembling. "They take them away. You have to be careful." Before Anna could respond, she noticed his eyes darting to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. "Louise, what do you see?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "They come for the ones who ask too many questions," he murmured, his face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't have come here." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud, and she wrestled with the growing sense of dread. "I need to know what happened to the others. Please help me understand," she urged, desperate for any insight. At that moment, the door swung open, and Dr. Ribeiro stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Anna, we have protocols to follow. Louise requires rest," he said sharply, interrupting their exchange. Anna felt a surge of frustration. "But he needs to talk." "Enough!" Dr. Ribeiro's voice cut through her protests like a knife. "You're here to provide care, not to pry into matters that don't concern you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Anna standing in the dim light, a heavy silence enveloping her. She glanced back at Louise, who had retreated further into the shadows, his eyes wide with fear. After her shift, Anna found herself wandering through the dimly lit corridors, an inexplicable pull guiding her toward the supply closet. The door creaked open, revealing stacks of boxes and outdated medical supplies. As she rummaged through the clutter, her fingers brushed against something hard and leather-bound. Curious, she pulled out an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were hastily scrawled, detailing the experiences of nurses who had come before her. Words like fear, escape, and "they know" echoed through her mind, chilling her to the core. The final entry was abrupt, a stark contrast to the rest. "They know." Anna's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a cold wave of terror wash over her. The whispers of those who had come before her reverberated in her mind, and she knew, deep down, that she had stumbled onto something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. The ward was a cage, and she was now trapped within its walls, just like the others. Anna sat in the dimly lit records room, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. The flickering fluorescent light above cast eerie shadows on the walls, but she was determined to uncover the truth hidden within the hospital's archives. As she rifled through the files, her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and resolve. Every folder she opened seemed to whisper secrets from the past, secrets that had been buried beneath layers of silence and neglect. "Here we go," she murmured to herself, pulling out a particularly thick binder labeled Patient Trials. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. Detailed accounts of experiments conducted on patients filled the pages, many of whom were described as non-compliant and unresponsive. Anna's stomach churned as she read about the methods used to silence their cries, chemical restraints, isolation chambers, and, most shockingly, surgical procedures that left them forever changed. Suddenly, a noise echoed from the hallway, soft, almost imperceptible laughter. Anna froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard it before, the laughter that seeped through the silence of the ward, and it sent shivers down her spine. Glancing around, she felt the oppressive weight of the darkness creeping closer, as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching her every move. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the fear aside and returned to the binder. "I have to know," she whispered, forcing herself to focus. She found a series of photographs documenting the patients before and after the experiments. The before images showed frightened faces, their eyes wide with confusion and pain, while the after images were haunting, hollow gazes that spoke of lost souls. "Nurses, where are you?" A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. It was Dr. Ribeiro, his tone smooth but laced with an edge that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't be in here alone, it's not safe." Anna quickly closed the binder and looked up, forcing a smile onto her face. "Just reviewing some records, doctor. I want to ensure I'm providing the best care possible." Dr. Ribeiro stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. "The patients need silence, Anna. You must understand that. Our methods are unconventional, but effective." "Effective?" Anna echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that what you call it? These experiments? They're inhumane." His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "You're new here, and I understand your skepticism. But trust me, the silence is for their own good. Sometimes the mind needs to be adjusted." Anna felt a chill run down her spine. "Adjusted? You mean silenced?" "Think about it," he continued, his voice soothing, almost persuasive. "Would you rather hear their screams or see them at peace? The world outside this place is cruel, and we offer them a refuge." Anna shook her head, her resolve strengthening. "Refuge or prison? I've seen what those experiments do to them, and it's not peace, it's torture." Dr. Ribeiro's smile returned, but it was devoid of warmth. "Then perhaps you should reconsider your position here, Anna. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." As he turned to leave, Anna felt a surge of determination. She had to find a way to expose the truth. But as she exited the records room, the laughter returned, echoing in the hallways. It was louder now, more insistent, as if beckoning her to follow. Against her better judgment, she moved toward the sound, her heart racing with a mix of fear and curiosity. The corridor stretched before her, dimly lit and lined with closed doors, each one hiding a story of suffering. Suddenly, she caught sight of a shadow slipping into a restricted area, dragging a patient along. The muffled screams that followed sent a jolt of terror through her. She had to act, but every instinct screamed at her to turn back. "Anna!" a voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Louise, the disturbed patient she had cared for earlier. His eyes were wide with fear, darting toward the shadows. "You shouldn't be here. They'll come for you." "I need to help," Anna replied, her voice steady despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "I can't just stand by." "No!" Louise grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You don't understand. They'll silence you too." Her breath hitched as she looked into his terrified eyes, realizing the depths of the horror that lay within the walls of the ward. The shadows loomed larger now, and the laughter grew louder, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. Anna knew she had to uncover the truth, but at what cost? Anna tossed and turned in her small, sterile bed, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on her chest. The darkness of the room seemed to seep into her mind, manifesting as twisted dreams that warped her perception of reality. In her sleep, she saw the faces of patients contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror, pleading for help that would never come. She awoke with a start, panting, her heart racing as the echo of their cries lingered in her ears. As the morning light filtered through the barred windows, she pushed herself out of bed, her resolve hardening. The ward's oppressive atmosphere felt even more suffocating now, and she knew she had to find answers before it was too late. After a quick breakfast, Anna made her way to the supply closet, hoping to uncover more clues about the facility's dark past. The remnants of the journal she had found still haunted her thoughts, especially the chilling final entry that whispered of impending doom. The air was thick with tension as she navigated the narrow corridors, her footsteps muffled against the cold floor tiles. She carefully opened the closet door, the hinges creaking in protest. As she rummaged through the shelves filled with medical supplies, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A dusty cardboard box sat wedged in the corner, partially obscured by medical charts. Curiosity piqued. She pulled it out and opened it, revealing a collection of disturbing photographs. Each image was a haunting reminder of the ward's grim history, nurses and patients alike, their faces frozen in expressions of fear. Dates were scribbled in the margins, many of them ominously close to her own arrival. Anna's stomach churned as she flipped through the photographs, a growing sense of dread washing over her. Just as she was about to examine the last photo, the lights flickered, and the ward was plunged into darkness. A power outage. Panic gripped her as she fumbled for her phone, its glow illuminating her surroundings, just enough to see the shadows dancing along the walls. She needed to find a way out, but the darkness felt alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Suddenly, she heard footsteps echoing down the hallway, growing louder, closer. Heart pounding, she quickly stashed the box behind a stack of linens and ducked behind a nearby shelf, holding her breath. 2 doctors entered the supply closet, their voices low but urgent. "We need to finalize the preparations for tonight," one of them said, his tone chillingly calm. "The last batch didn't respond well, but we have to proceed. It's for the greater good." "What if someone finds out?" the other replied, anxiety creeping into his voice. "The nurses are getting suspicious." Anna strained to hear more, her heart racing as the dread of discovery loomed over her. "We can't show weakness. The silence is paramount. They must not be allowed to speak," the first doctor insisted. "Tonight, we'll ensure they remain silent, permanently." The word sent a wave of nausea through Anna. She had suspected something sinister was afoot, but this confirmed her worst fears. They were conducting experiments, unethical, inhumane procedures intended to erase the patients' voices, their very humanity. As the doctors continued to discuss their plans, her mind raced with thoughts of escape. Just as she began to inch away from her hiding spot, a noise echoed behind her, a shelf collapsing in her haste to retreat. The doctors turned, their expressions shifting from conversation to alarm. "Who's there?" one called out, his voice sharp with authority. Panicked, Anna darted out of the closet, her heart pounding in her ears. She sprinted down the dimly lit corridor, the sounds of their footsteps chasing her from behind. The laughter from her dreams echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the silent screams she had witnessed. She needed to find a way to warn the others, to expose the horrors lurking within the walls of the ward. As she dashed through the hallways, the oppressive silence felt more suffocating than ever. Every corner she turned seemed to lead her deeper into the maze, the shadows closing in around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she fought against the rising tide of despair. She could not become another victim. She had to find a way to escape the chilling grip of the ward's secrets. Suddenly she stumbled into a common area, the flickering emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the room. The sight of the empty chairs and the quiet space sent a shiver down her spine. She could almost hear the echoes of past conversations, the laughter that had once filled the air, now replaced by a suffocating silence. "Anna?" A voice broke through her thoughts. It was Clara, her fellow nurse, standing at the entrance, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I found something," Anna stammered, her voice trembling. "We need to talk, now." Anna's heart raced as she paced her dimly lit quarters, the shadows stretching ominously against the walls. She could still hear the hushed whispers of her own thoughts, battling against the chilling laughter that haunted the hallways. She had to confront Nurse Clara. There was no turning back now. The truth demanded to be uncovered. The next morning, Anna found Clara sitting alone in the break room, her eyes cast downward, fingers nervously twisting a thread from her uniform. The usual cheerful demeanor of the nurse seemed to have been replaced by an unsettling heaviness. Anna approached hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clara, can we talk?" Clara looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to apprehension. "About what, Anna?" There was a tremor in her voice, as if she already knew where the conversation was headed. "The patients. The silence. I need to know what's really happening here." Anna's heart thudded in her chest as she spoke, her resolve solidifying with each word. "I found something in the supply closet. Their stories, they can't be true, right?" Clara's gaze dropped again, and for a moment the room was thick with silence. "You shouldn't have done that," she murmured, almost to herself. "You don't understand what you're asking." I understand more than you think. I heard them, Clara. The laughter. It's not just in my head. They're suffering, and we need to help them, Anna pressed, desperation lacing her tone. Finally, Clara met her gaze, and Anna was taken aback by the sadness etched into her features. You don't know the half of it, Clara said, her voice cracking. They're conducting lobotomies here. It's the only way to silence them completely. Anna felt a cold wave wash over her. Lobotomies? They can't be serious. Clara nodded, her expression grave. It's true. They take them into the back rooms, those who resist, those who scream too much. It's easier for everyone if they just disappear. Why haven't you said anything? Anna's voice was rising now, filled with indignation. We have to stop this. Clara shook her head, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she feared being overheard. You don't understand. You think you can expose them? You think anyone would believe you? Anna clenched her fists, frustration boiling within her. I don't care if they believe me. This is wrong. We can't just let it happen. Please, Anna, Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. You have to let it go. It's safer that way. For you, for me, for everyone. What about the patients? Anna demanded. What about their lives? Clara's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark crossing her face. They're already dead in here, Anna. You just can't see it yet. The weight of Clara's words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Anna felt her stomach drop. I won't let you convince me of that. I have to gather evidence and expose them, even if it's the last thing I do. Clara's eyes widened, panic flashing in them. You're making a mistake. As dusk fell, Anna retreated to her room, her mind racing with Clara's revelation. She needed proof. The following night, she gathered her courage and a small camera, determined to document everything she could find. She slipped through the shadows, her heart pounding against her ribcage as she navigated the hallways, guided only by the faint glimmer of her flashlight. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft creaking of the building. As she approached the restricted area, her breath quickened. She could hear muffled voices behind the door, laughter mingling with something far more sinister. Suddenly the door creaked open, and Anna froze, her pulse racing. Dr. Ribeiro stepped out, his expression inscrutable. What are you doing here, nurse? His tone was deceptively calm, but there was an edge to it that sent chills down her spine. Anna's mind raced as she quickly concealed the camera behind her back. I was just checking on the patients, she stammered, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. Dr. Ribeiro's gaze narrowed, and a smirk twisted his lips. You really shouldn't wander where you're not supposed to. It could lead to unfortunate consequences. Anna swallowed hard, her instinct screaming at her to run, but she stood her ground. I won't be silenced. I know what you're doing here. With a sudden menacing laugh, he leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin. You think you're brave, don't you? But bravery only gets you so far. Remember the nurses who came before you? They thought they could fight back too. Before Anna could respond, he stepped back, his smile widening. I suggest you return to your duties. Or perhaps you'd like to join the patients in their silence? A surge of panic shot through her, and without another thought, Anna turned and fled into the labyrinthine corridors. Her heart raced, the haunting laughter echoing behind her, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. She had to escape, to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. The walls seemed to close in around her as she ran, each step echoing in the silence that threatened to consume her. As Anna sprinted through the dimly lit corridors, the sound of her heart pounding in her ears drowned out the sinister laughter that taunted her from the shadows. She could almost feel the cold breath of the ward's secrets nipping at her heels as she approached what she hoped would be her salvation, the exit. The heavy door loomed ahead, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. Just as she reached for the handle, a familiar voice called out from the gloom. Anna, wait! The voice was soft but urgent, laced with a desperation that made Anna freeze in her tracks. Turning slowly, she found Nurse Clara, stepping out from the shadows, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. Clara, thank God. We have to get out of here. They're coming for us. Anna exclaimed, her breath hitching in her throat as she took a step toward her colleague. Clara's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark crossing her features. "You don't understand, Anna," she said, her voice trembling. "There's no escape. Not for us. Not for anyone." "What are you talking about?" Anna demanded, frustration boiling over. "We can't just give up. We have to expose them. We have to save the patients." Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway, as if expecting the doctors to materialize from the walls. "You don't know what they've done, what they're capable of. I thought I could help them, help the patients, but it's all a lie. We're all trapped here," she confessed, her voice breaking. A chill ran down Anna's spine as the weight of Clara's words sank in. "No, you can't believe that. We can fight this together. They've manipulated you, Clara. You have to remember who you are." But Clara's gaze hardened, and a twisted smile crept onto her lips. "You don't get it, do you? I've seen things, Anna. I've been part of them. I can't go back." Her eyes glimmered with a madness that sent a shiver through Anna's core. "I'm not like you anymore." In that moment, Anna felt a crushing sense of betrayal. The woman she thought she could count on had already succumbed to the very darkness they were trying to escape. "You don't have to do this," Anna pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can still make it out together." Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed ominously through the corridor, growing louder with each passing second. Anna's heart raced as she turned to see the figures of Dr. Ribeiro and several other doctors emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted into sinister smiles. They had been waiting, anticipating her every move. "Did you really think you could escape, Anna?" Dr. Ribeiro taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You've been such a curious little mouse, but this is where your story ends." Panic surged through Anna as she realized the trap that had been laid for her. She looked back at Clara, desperation etched into her features. "Clara, please, don't let them take me." But instead of reaching out, Clara stepped back, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Anna. I can't go against them. I'm one of them now." "No!" Anna shouted, her voice cracking. "You're not! You're still a nurse. You can still help." But the light in Clara's eyes had dimmed completely. The laughter of the doctors echoed through the corridor, mingling with the silence that enveloped them. With a swift movement, Clara turned and walked toward them, leaving Anna alone in the oppressive darkness. "Join us, Clara," Dr. Ribeiro beckoned, extending a hand to her. "Together, we can silence the rest." Anna felt her heart sink as she realized the harrowing truth. Clara had become a part of the very horror they had sought to escape. She was not just lost, she was complicit. As the doctors closed in, Anna felt a wave of despair wash over her. The walls of the ward seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with their secrets. She was trapped in a nightmare where every whisper, every shadow, was a reminder of humanity's darkest impulses. In a final, desperate act, Anna turned to flee, but the laughter grew louder, drowning out her cries for help. The ward consumed her, and in that chilling moment, she realized there was no escape from the silence that awaited her, just as it had for the nurses before her. The darkness had claimed another soul, leaving behind only whispers of what once was.